Greetings. Hi there once again. This is Clifford Bates, and welcome to Reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. Today we're starting at chapter 100. Now he's going to say this is which, in book one, chapter 100. Um, because next we come to the uh, uh, actions by land and by sea at the river of Euthermon between the Athenians and their allies, the Persians. And when Athenians won both battles on the same day under the leadership of Simon of Mithridates and captured and destroyed the whole Phoenician fleet, consisting of 200 vessels. Sometime afterwards occurred the defection of the Thracians, caused by disagreements about the markets of the on the opposite coast of Thrace and about the mine in their possession. Sailing with a fleet to Thanos, the Athenians defeated them at sea and effected a. Oh, we got some noise outside. Effected a landing on the island. About the time, at the same time, they sent 10,000 settlers of their own citizens and the allies to settle the place called Enia, Holdai, or the Nine Ways, now Amphipolis. They succeeded in gaining possession of Enia Holdai from the Edonians, but on advancing into the interior of Thrace, they were cut off in Drabicus, a city of Edonians and settled by Thracians, who regarded the settlement on the place of Enia Holdai as an act of hostility. Oh, sorry. So therefore, they went up the Thrace, and Amphipolis up there, and they did this because there was a mine there. This was a thing. Meanwhile, the Thracians, being defeated in the field and suffering siege, appealed to Sparta and desired her to assail them by invading Attica. Unknown to the Athenians, she promised and intended to do so, but was prevented by this occurrence of the earthquake, accompanied by the secession of the Helots and the Theratos and the Antitheus of the Perikoi of Imo. In other words, he had an earthquake. Not only earthquake, the Athenians promised to help the Thracians. They were going to invade Attica. Okay, but what happened? First of all, an earthquake, which affected the Peloponnese. Second, the Helots, said, no, we're not going to give you food anymore. And then the Theratos and the Antichaeans of Perikoi in Neom also refused to support the Spartans. Most of the Helots were descendants of the old Messians that were enslaved in the famous war, and so all of them came to be called Messians. The Spartans, thus, being engaged in a war with the rebels in Etium, and the Thracians in the third year of the siege obtained terms from the Athenians by raising their walls, delivering up their ships, and arranged to pay money demanded at once, a tribute in the future, giving up possessions on the mainland together with the mine. In other words, it's the silver mine. This is going to be the big thing with the. Meanwhile, the Spartans, finding the war against the rebels in Enomia was likely to be a long one, evoked the aids of the allies, especially of the Athenians, who came in some force under the command of Simon. The reason for this pressing summons lay in the reputed skill of siege operations. A long siege had taught the Spartans of their own deficiency in this art, else they would have taken the place by assault. The first open quarrel with the Spartans and the Athenians arose out of this exposition. The Spartans, when the assault failed to take place, apprehended the enterprising and revolutionary character of the Athenians, and further looked upon them as as an alien extraction, began to fear that if they remained, they might persuade by the besieged to attempt some political changes. In other words, they might, oh my God, they might, they stayed here and they kept on helping us. Maybe they might make, um, and they accordingly dismissed them alone of the allies without declaring their suspicion, but immediately saying that they had no need of them. But the Athenians, aware that their dismissal did not proceed from more honorable reasons of the two, but from suspicion, had been conceived, which had been conceived, went away deeply offended, considering of having done nothing to merit the treatment of the Spartans. And in the instant that they returned home, they broke off the alliance which had been made against the Mede, and allied themselves with Sparta's enemies, Argos, which of the contracting parties taking the same oath and making the same alliance with the Thylesians. In other words, contracting of each of the contracting powers taking the same oaths and making the same alliance with the Athenians now make a more formal alliance. They have all these allies and these things. Now they come home. They're angry how Cimon went to help the Spartans, and all of a sudden things weren't going great for the Spartans. They didn't know how to do things, and they started to fear. They saw their inferiority in some things, particularly technology and technique, against the Athenians, and that things weren't going as fast as they'd like it, and they didn't really. The longer the Athenians stayed in the Peloponnese to help them, they feared that they might cause political that their presence might lead and the way their alien character might lead to political change. That some of the people, including the city that's rebelling, might make political changes akin theirs, and that would not be something that it would be in the interest of the Spartans. So they started to fear the influence of Athens, not just the power of Athens, but the influence of Athens, what Athens stood for. And thus, when the Athenians were sent home, oh, we don't need you anymore. And the Athenians took this as the dishonor that it was. And being dishonored, they got angry to the point of saying, okay, we don't need you. We honored our alliance. You don't want us. You sent us away. Um, you did it out of fear from us and out of distrust from us. Um, that's disrespectful. We're breaking off our alliances. And by the way, we're going to make allies with your arch enemy, Argos, and the Thessalians. Okay. Meanwhile, the rebels at unable to prolong further a 10 years resistance, surrendered the Spartans, the condition being that they should depart from the Peloponnese under safe conduct and never should set foot again. Anyone who might thereafter be found there was to be their slave, the slave of the captor. This must be known that the Spartans had an old oracle. It must be known that the Spartans had an old oracle from Delphi to the effect that they should let go the supplicants of Zeus at Enon. So they went forth with their children and wives, and being received by Athenians because of their hatred they felt for the Spartans, were located at Nipitus, which she was largely taken from the Ozoloian Locratians. The Athenians received another addition to their confederacy in the Megaeans, who'd left the Spartan alliance annoyed by the war about boundaries forced on them by Corinth. The Athenians occupied Megra and Pega and built for the Megaeans their long wall from the city to Nicaea, in which they placed an Athenian garrison. This was the principal cause of the Athenians conceiving a deadly hatred against the Athenians. Meanwhile, Arjono, son of Passamilikios, the Libyan king of the Liberian on the Egyptian border, having his headquarters at Myria, the city above Perthos, caused a revolt almost the whole of Egypt, from King Artaxias, and placing himself at its head, invited the Athenians to his assistance. Abandoning a Cyprian expedition upon which they happened to be engaged with 200 ships of their own and their alliance, the Athenians arrived in Egypt and sailed from the sea into the Nile and made themselves master of the river and 2/3 of Memphis, and addressed themselves to the attack of the remaining third, in which is called the White Castle. Within it, the Persians and the Medes who had taken refuge there, and the Egyptians who had not joined the rebellion. In other words, in that castle. At this time, the other Athenians, making their descent from the fleet upon Helekes, were engaged by a force of Corinthians and Epeirians, and the Corinthians were victorious. Afterwards, the Athenians engaged the Peloponnesian fleet of Carpipia, and the Athenians were victorious. Subsequently, war broke out between Aegis and Athens, and there was a great battle at sea off Aegea between the Athenians and the Aegeans, which, being aided by their allies, and which victory remained with the Athenians, took 70 of the enemy's ships and landed in the country and commenced a siege under the command of Leocrates, the son of Strabos. Thus, upon this, the Peloponnesian, desirous of aiding them, Aegeans, threw into Aegean a force of 300 hoplites, who had before been serving with the Corinthians and Epidaurians. Meanwhile, the Corinthians and their allies occupied the heights of Garantia and marched down into the Megrid, in the belief that with a large force absent in Aegea and Egypt, Athens would be unable to help the Megrians without raising the siege of Aegean. But the Athenians, instead of moving the army of Aegea, raised the force of old and young men that had been left in the city, and marched into the Megrid under the command of Myrones. And after a drawn battle with the Corinthians, the rivals' hosts parted, each with the impression that they had gained a victory. The Athenians, however, if anything, had rather the advantage, and the departure of the Corinthians set up a trophy. Urged by the taunts of the elders in the cities, the Corinthians made preparations. About 12 days afterwards, came and set up their trophy as victors. Sallying out from Megea, the Athenians destroyed the party that was employed to erect the trophy and engaged and defeated the rest. That's a great line. So what happens is the battle. The boys and the men go out to fight the battle. The Corinthians were. No one was sure who's won. Both probably won. So what happened was the Athenians made put their trophy up there. There's their thing of the victory, celebrate the victory. And then what happens is that the Corinthians say, "Oh, you won that too. You better go." And so they send troops and the people to go put up there, and the Athenians then destroy the trophy makers and then defeat the rest of the army. Oh, that is precious. 106. The retreat of the vanquished army, a considerable division size, considerable unit, pressed by the pursuers and mistaking the road, dashed into a field of some private property with a deep trench on all rounds and no way out. Being acquainted with the place, the Athenians hemmed their front with hoplites, and placing the light troops around the circle, stoned all who'd gone in. Corinth had suffered a severe blow. The bulk of her army continued its retreat home. Okay, so this is what happened at Megara. A large unit of the Athenians are just wiped out. 107. About this time, the Athenians began to build the long walls to the sea, that towards Perithum and that towards Piraeus. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians made an expedition against Doris, the old home of the Spartans, containing the cities of Baltum, Sinum, and Irenum. Had they taken one of those cities, when the Spartans under Neomedes, son of Cleobrotus, commanded the king of Protax, son of Pianusius, who was still a minor, came to the aid of the Dorians with 1,500 hoplites of their own and 10,000 of their allies. After compelling the Phoenicians to restore the city on conditions, they began their retreat. The route by sea across the Crypsian Gulf exposed them to the risk of being stopped by an Athenian fleet. That by land across Judea seems scarcely safe, with the Athenians holding Megria and Pegaeus, but the pass was a difficult one, and always guarded by the Athenians. In the present instance, the Spartans had informed that they meant to dispute the passage. So they resolved to remain in Boeotia and considered it would be safe, the safest line of march. They also, for another reason for this resolve, secret encouragement had been given them by a party in Athens who hoped to put an end to the reign of democracy, in building the long walls. Meanwhile, the Athenians marched against them, and the whole levy and 1,000 Argives, with respective contingent from the rest of the allies. Together with altogether, they were 14,000 strong. The march was prompted by the notion that the Spartans were at a loss how to effect passage, and also by a suspicion of the attempt to overthrow the democracy. Some cavalry joined the Athenians from the Thessalian allies, but these went over to the Spartans during the battle. It is the map of the First Peloponnesian War. This is the battle was fought at Tangales at Botia. After heavy losses on both sides, victory declared for the Spartans and their allies. After entering Midgrid and cutting down the fruit trees, the Spartans returned home across Guria and the Isthmus. 62 days after the battle, the Athenians marched into Bridger and, under the command of Myranes, defeated the Boeotians and landed at Opida and became masters of Boeotia and Phocis. They dismantled the walls on the Thracians and took 100 of the richest men of the Optian Lauretians as hostages and furnished their own long walls. This was followed by the surrender of the Aegiatans to the Athenians on conditions. They pulled down their walls and gave up their ships and paid tributes in future. The Athenians sailed round the Peloponnese under Ptolemy, son of Ptolemy, Ptolemaios, not Odadas, no D, Ptolemaios, burned the arsenal of Sparta and took Kelis, a city of the Corinthians, and in descent upon Cithaeron defeated the Scythians in battle. Now 109. Meanwhile, the Athenians in Egypt and their allies stayed on and encountered all the vicissitudes of war. First, the Athenians were masters of Egypt, and then the king sent Megabus, a Persian, to Sparta with money to bribe the Peloponnesians to invade Attica and draw off the Athenians from Egypt. Finding that the matter made no progress and that the money was being wasted, he recalled Megabutus with the remainder of the money and sent Megabutus' son Zarapusus, a Persian with a large army, to Egypt. Arriving by land, he defeated the Egyptians and their allies in battles and drove the Hellenes out of Memphis, and at length shut them up on the island of Prosopitis, where he besieged them for a year and 6 months. At last, draining the canal of its waters, he diverted it to another channel. He left their ships high and dry, and joined the most joined the island to the mainland, and then marched over on foot and captured it. The enterprise of the Hellenes came. The enterprise of the Hellenes came to ruin after 6 years of war. All of that large host and a few traveling through Libya reached Cairene in safety, but most of them perished. And thus Egypt returned to the subjugation of the king, except Aremenes, the king in the marshes, whom they were unable to capture from the extent of the marches, the marshmen being almost as the most warlike of Egyptians. In Neros, the Libyan king, the sole author of the Egyptian revolt, was betrayed, taken, and crucified. Meanwhile, a relieving squadron of 50 trimenes had sailed from Athens with the rest of the Confederacy and the rest of the Confederacy for Egypt. They put into the shore at the Medicean mouth of the Nile and told Argonas what had occurred. Attacked on land side by the troops and from the sea by the Phoenician navy, most of the ships were destroyed. The few remaining being saved by retreat. Such was the end of the great expedition of the Egyptians and their allies to Egypt. Meanwhile, Orestes, son of Thessian king Echecletes, being in exile from Thessaly, persuaded the Athenians to restore him, taking with them the Boeotians and the Phoenicians as allies. The Athenians marched to Pa- okay, Parlesius in Thessaly. They became masters of the country through only an immediate vicinity of the camp, beyond which they could not go for fear of the Thessalian cavalry. But they failed to take the city or to attain any of the other objects of their expedition, and returned home with Orestes without having any of the objects of their expedition. And returned home with Orestes without having effected anything. Not long after this, 1,000 of Athenians embarked in their vessels that were at Pegaea. Pegaea, it must be remembered, now was theirs, and sailed along the coast to Siron under the command of Pericles' son Xanthippus, landing in Siron and defeating the Thessalians who engaged them. They immediately took them with the Achaeans and sailing across, marched and laid siege to Orestes, Oiadia in Arcadia. Failing to take it, they return home. So Athens becomes a little more aggressive. They go to Egypt. The Egyptian campaign failed because the king first wanted to have someone else do it for them, try to bribe the Spartans to go do it. The Spartans didn't really work out. The Persian king finally sends his own. They defeat that. They defeat both the Egyptians and the 3 years afterwards, a truce was made between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians for 5 years. Released from the Hellenistic War, the Athenians made the expedition to Cyprus with 200 vessels of their own under the allies of command of Cimon. 60 of these were detached to Egypt, and the rest of the Eretemos. And the king of the marshes and the rest laid siege to Scythium, from which, however, they were compelled to retire by the death of Simon and by the scarcity of provision. Sailing off Salamis in Cyprus, they fought with the Phoenicians and Cyprians and Cilicians by land and by sea, and being victorious in both elements, departed home. And with the squadrons that had returned from Egypt after this, the Spartans marched out on a sacred war and became masters of the temple at Delphi. Placed it in the hands of the Delphians. Immediately after the retreat, the Athenians marched out and became masters of the temple and placed it in the hands of the Phocians. Sometime after this, 1,000 Athenians with allied contingents under the command of Timothes, son of Timolos, marched against Orchomenos, Chimerion, and other places. This is now chapter 113, and Botea, that were in the hands of the Botean exiles. They took Cornea, made slaves of their inhabitants, and leaving a garrison, commenced their return. On the way, they were attacked at Cornea by the Botian exiles from Orchim, Orchomenos, with some the Croatians and Ubanian exiles, and others who were at the same way of thinking. The Athenians were defeated in battle, and some were killed, and others were captured. The Athenians evacuated all Boeotia by a treaty providing for the recovery of the men, and the exiled Boeotians returned, and with the rest, all the rest regained their independence. So the Boeotians defeated the Athenians at Cornea, and then they regained their independence. This was soon afterwards followed by the revolt of Euboea from Athens. Pericles had already crossed over with an army of Athenians to the island. When the news was brought to him that Megara had revolted, and that the Peloponnese were on the point of invading Attica, and that the Athenian garrison had been cut off by the Magians, with the exception of a few who had taken refuge in Nessius, Nessia. The Megrians had introduced the Corinthians, Cerithians, and Epidaurians into the city before they revolted. Meanwhile, Pericles brought back his army in all haste from Euboea. After this, the Peloponnesians, under the command of King Belotraxus, son of Panusius, marched into Attica as far as Utheus and Thyrsia, ravaging the country, and without advancing further returned home. The Athenians then crossed over again to Euboea under the command of Pericles and subdued the whole island. When they settled all the rest of the island by means of agreed terms, they expelled the people of Histasia and occupied the territories themselves. 114. Not long after their return from Euboea, they made a peace treaty with the Spartans and their allies for 30 years, giving up the posts which they occupied in the Peloponnese, in Aegeus, Peja, and Theon, and Archides. In other words, they gave up. In the 6th year, the truce war broke out between Samasian and Meglias about Prinine. Worst in the war, the militians came to Athens with loud complaints against Samians. In this, they were joined by a certain private person from Samos itself who wished to change the constitution by revolution. Accordingly, the Athenians sailed to Samos with 40 ships and set up a democracy, took hostages from the Samnians, 50 boys and many men, lodged them in Lemos, and then, after leaving the garrison in the island, returned home. Some of the Samians, however, did not remain at the island, but had fled to the continent, making an agreement with the most powerful of those in the city, and an alliance with Pistithius, son of Hystaspes, who I think has Hastasbes, who at the time controlled Sardis for the Persians. They had got together a force of 700 mercenaries, and under the cover of night crossed over the Samos. Their first step was to raise against the people, most of whom they secured. Their next was to steal the hostages from the Lemos. After that, they revolted, gave up the Athenian garrison, left with them its commander to Pisistratus, instantly prepared for the expedition against Miletus. The Byzantines also revolted with them. Soon after the Athenians heard news, they sailed with 70 ships against Samos. 16 of them went to Cara, took out the Phoenician fleet, and to Caros and the Lesbos, carrying around orders of reinforcement, and so never engaged. But 44 ships under the commands of Pericles and 9 colleagues gave battle off the island of Tegea to 70 Samian vessels, of which 20 were mere transports, as they were sailing from Mytilus. Victory remained with the Athenians, reinforced afterwards by 40 ships from Athens and 25 from Calian and Lesbian vessels. The Athenians landed, having the superiority by land, besieged the city with three walls, and blockaded it from the sea. Meanwhile, Pericles took 60 ships from the blockading squadrons and departed in haste for Calmus and Caria. Intelligence has been brought of the of an approach of a Phoenician fleet to the aid of the Samians. Indeed, Steagoras and others left the island with 5 ships to bring them. But now this is on 17, chapter 117. But in the meantime, the Sarmatians made a sudden sally, and fell on camp, which they found unfortified. Destroying the lookout vessels and engaging, defeating such were being launched to meet them. They remained masters of their own sea for 14 days and carried in and carried out what they pleased. But on the arrival of Pericles, they were once more shut up. Fresh reinforcements arrived, 40 ships from Athens with Thucydides, Hadagon, Promio, and 20 with Theopolemos and Antichiles, and 30 vessels from Chiros and Lesbos. After a brief attempt at fighting, the Sarmatians, unable to hold out after a 9-month siege, were forced to surrender on terms. They razed their walls, gave hostages, delivered up their ships, and arranged to pay the expenses of the war by installments. The Byzantinians also agreed to be subject as before. So the rebellion kind of broke down. After this, though not many years later, we at length come to what we have been related to, the affairs of Croatia and Podatus, and the events had been served as the pretext for the present war. All of these actions of the Hellenes against each other and the barbarians occurred in the 50-year interval between the retreat of Xerxes and the beginning of the present war. During this interval, the Athenians succeeded in placing their empire on the firmer basis and themselves advanced their own power at a very great height. The Spartans, though fully aware of it, opposed it only for a little while, but maintained inactive during most of the period, being an old slow to go to war except under the pressure of necessity. And the present instance being hampered by the wars at home. Finally, the growth of Athenian power could no longer be ignored, as their own confederacy became the object of its encroachment. They felt that they could endure it no longer, but that the time had come for them to throw themselves heart and soul into hostile power and break it, if they could, by commencing the present war. 3. And though the Spartans had made up their own mind on such a fact of the breach of the treaty and the guilt of the Athenians, yet they sent to Delphi and inquired to the gods whether it would be well with them if they went to war. And it was reported, received from him the answer, the Apollo, the oracle, that if they put their whole strength into the war, victory would be theirs, and the promise that he himself would be with them whenever invoked or uninvoked. It was the god Apollo. The oracle is playing games here. The oracle is clearly on Spartan side. He says, "Go to the war, and Apollo will be on your side." Okay, now this is at 119, chapter 119. Still, they wish to summon their allies and to take their vote on the propriety of making the war. After the ambassadors and the Confederates had arrived, the Congress has been conceived. They all spoke their minds, most of them denouncing the Athenians, demanding that the war should begin, especially the Corinthians. They had before their own canvases the cities separately and before their own accords. So let's stop here because we're going to have to do this. I'll probably have to return to this thing here. So 100 to 119, 118 we did today. I probably will have to go over to 119 again because what is 119 does? 119 basically sets up the speeches that are going to happen here at the conference. Okay. So the Allies. Sparta will give a speech justifying the war, what's going on, should we do it, and therefore this will be the speech to the Allies. So we're going to stop here. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below, and if I see them, I will answer them. I will answer them when I see them. If I will see them most likely. If you liked it, share with a friend. You want to subscribe, subscribe uh, to see more of this content. Again, show a friend, tell a friend, please. Um, um, Find me on social media below. I have my social media stuff below. I know that I'm also I think this is also being uploaded every time I upload it on Facebook. It's being automatically uploaded on Odyssey, and I hope it's being uploaded on Odyssey and that. But we'll see. Well, I'll check Odyssey. And that's with it. Have a good day. Take care. Bye bye.